Look at the picture of Adam Lanza, right? He looks violent, he looks deranged, et cetera, et cetera. Is there some truth to this, though? Do people with mental illness tend to be more violent than other people? It's a somewhat complicated question. On average, yes, slightly, but there's a much bigger risk factor for violence. And what's that called? Being male. Having a Y chromosome is a much bigger risk factor for violence than having a mental illness. Number two, only a few forms of mental disorder are linked to violence. What's one of them? Conduct disorder, antisocial personality disorder. We talked about that a few weeks ago, by definition. What's another? If you have schizophrenia or bipolar type 1 and you become psychotic delusional. People who are really delusional, especially if you have the delusional belief that people are out to attack you, what do you tend to do? Attack first. What's the biggest mental disorder linked to violence? Far and away, drug use. If you're drunk or you're high, the risk of committing violence far outweighs being psychotic or having a conduct disorder. Other than those conditions, having a mental illness is not linked to violence at all, but what's it linked to? Being victimized by violence. People with serious mental illness are very likely to be targets and prey for other violent people. So the stereotype is really wrong. Yes, some forms of mental illness are linked to violent behavior, especially using drugs. We can treat those, but the stereotype is everybody with mental illness is violent. And so what does that do? It raises, back a couple slides ago, the threat idea. So in interest of time, we're not going to do a big history. How have people with mental disorders been treated from the time we started to record historical documents? Not very well. It makes you believe in the evolutionary models. People banished leper colonies. Leprosy, talk about a disease that makes you look deformed, et cetera, et cetera. What's leprosy today called? Hansen's disease. What causes it? It's a bacteria. We can treat it. But for time immemorial, if you looked like you're that contagious, and you could be because it was bacterial, lots of banishment, and the same applied to people who looked, quote, crazy. There were some bright spots. Hippocrates said mental illness is caused by an imbalance in the four humors, the four bodily liquids, et cetera, and led to bloodletting, which was the main treatment for physical and mental disorder for about 2,000 years. In the Renaissance, right around the time of Bosch's painting, maybe crazy disturbed behavior is a part of brain functioning. Now, 600-700 years later, we've got brain images to show that. What happened in the late 1700s, early 1800s? The Enlightenment, reason, special facilities were created for people with mental illness. And what did those turn into by the late 19th century? Big snake pit state institutions. So really well-intended reform can go bad. What happened in the late 20th century? We've got to close the snake pits down. We're going to take away mental hospitals and leave community care. And so what does community care look like now? Market Street and Telegraph Ave. No services, people languishing with no place to go. Unless we invest money in community treatment, the mental hospitals are San Francisco County Jail, LA County Jail, or Telegraph Ave. So reforms can go wrong. We've got to really sustain efforts. Let's go back to attribution theory. If you have been awake and alert for the last few weeks in this course, what have you learned? ADHD's heritability is pushing 80%. Bipolar disorder, 80, 85, 90%. Autism, autistic disorder, 85 to 90%. The roots of much mental illness are highly genetic. Now, there's epigenetics, and there's gene-environment correlations and interactions, et cetera, et cetera. But it's hard to argue the case that we did 50 years ago that it's all caused by crummy parenting. So the National Institute of Mental Health decided, once the twin and adoption studies started to be published a couple of decades ago, we're going to eliminate stigma in the United States by calling mental illness a brain disease. So we talked about 10 or 15 minutes ago. Because look, if it's a disease of your brain, we're not going to blame you. Kind of makes sense, right? Remember, if that disturbed behavior on BART is because a person's acting out of control, we're going to blame them. But if it was a seizure, then they couldn't help it, low blame. So what happens, in fact, when we start to tell people in experiments that mental illness is caused by genes, or it's a brain disease? Well, it doesn't go quite as simply as you think it would. In fact, many people who are led to believe that mental illness is related to genes or is a brain disease are more punitive than they otherwise would be toward the person with mental illness. So it sort of goes against attribution theory. Why? Well, maybe it's not attribution at all. It's number one here. Maybe if the behavior is disturbed enough, doesn't matter what I think about what caused it, it's threatening and I'm going to push it away. Number two, oh, come on, does everybody have ADHD? Does everybody have a learning disorder? These are all excuses. And of course, the rates are going up. Maybe we tend to blame because we think that nobody's responsible for their behavior anymore. Number three, if my mental disorder, you're looking at me, I'm under the microscope, and you say, God, Hinshaw's behavior is really disturbed. It's because of his genes. Well, what can I do about it? I was born that way. So maybe the genetic brain attribution makes you very pessimistic that I can never change. Number four, if my behavior is threatening to you, I'm acting really disturbed, and you think it's because of my genes, maybe I'm not fully human. So yeah, maybe I could be contagious. Remember, that's the first evolutionary module. Maybe I'm going to exploit you, give you all bad grades, you wouldn't like me. But if it's my aberrant behavior is because of my genes, maybe Hinshaw and his family don't have the same chromosomes and DNA as the rest of the species. I'm part of a different tribe. So that tribal stigma may come up. Once you start to believe that someone isn't fully human, what happens? Genocide. What did Hitler call the people who were against the Aryan race? Vermin, insects, predators, parasites. Once you start to dehumanize, really bad consequences will happen. And it may be that genes, the simple explanation that all mental illness is caused by bad genes or bad brains, backfires, and we think the person is really subhuman. What should we say about mental illness? Well, we should have everybody take Psych 131 and learn about gene-environment correlation and say, yes, genes are a risk factor, but there's protective factors, and there's transactional models, and you put that in a newspaper headline and nobody buys the paper. It's too complicated. It's not a yes-no story. The actual truth about developmental models is they're probabilistic, and there's reciprocal transactional patterns, and hard to put in a headline of it's all genes or it's all environment. So we've got a hard sell in trying to promote this developmental psychopathology model. So I mentioned this a couple minutes ago. Other than the research, how do we know that mental illness is stigmatized? Look at the media. Looney Tunes, Daffy Duck. Look at the old cartoon characters. Half of them look pretty deranged, and that's kids' first exposure to mental illness. What do kids say? Go to the Child Study Center, go to the preschool, playground. And kids are playing, and somebody's doing something bad, especially the boys will say this, hey, you spaz. Hey, retard. Are you psycho? 3 really derogatory words about physical disability, intellectual disability, and mental disorder. Where are kids hearing those words? On TV, from families, from older siblings, from neighbors. It's part of the culture. We talked about the laws, again, and sometimes I say this, tongue-in-cheek. If you're crazy enough to admit you have a mental illness, you've got to be pretty crazy to do that, don't get your driver's license renewed, you can't vote, no jury, lose custody of your kids, and in some states you can't run for office. So it's good in 1860 that law wasn't on the books in the United States because Lincoln would have never been president. Severe depressions, clear hypomania, probably bipolar type 2. Would Churchill have been prime minister of England? You want to talk about alcoholism? Have you read how much he drank when he came over and visited FDR? When the war started over there before America got in, he would have champagne most of the night and then bourbon with cards and wake up to whiskey for breakfast. I mean, he would have never been elected if we'd said that alcoholism or depression is a mental illness that leads you to not run for office. But of course, the one group who never has any stigma are therapists, clinical psychologists, psychiatrists, right? Ask people with serious mental illness where they get most of their stigma. From the doctors who treat them, from the emergency rooms that won't, oh my God, we got gunshot victims here, not crazy people. What's one of the acronyms, if you've ever done medical stuff, a GOMER? Get out of my emergency room, because you don't have a real illness. What do a lot of people with serious mental illness say that their therapists convey to them? Well, you'll never really get a job. Why would you think of going back to school? It's low expectations, which is highly stigmatizing too. I think there was a question somewhere out of my peripheral vision, or did I just imagine that?
No, I heard everything.
Okay, yeah, what, do you want to say it?
Well, I was just wondering if it was in these middle ground states you have
Those laws,
yeah.
yeah.
If that applied to all kinds of mental
Well, so do these laws apply to schizophrenia or all mental illness? It varies. So when you renew your California driver's license, isn't there a thing on the back saying, do you have a mental disability? So usually it's pretty generic. And you always put no, which means you have to lie. Because if you're open, you would lose your rights. Again, if I can't see well, I shouldn't drive. Please don't let me have my license. But if I was depressed 5 years ago, that's in the same category, and it's discriminatory. So sometimes it's specific categories, but much more often it's a generic, do you have a mental disability? Question? So yeah, what about media? What about A Beautiful Mind, 1998, right? Really different from the book. They didn't talk about, in the movie, John Nash's cruising gay bars and refusing to stay on medications. They wanted to make it a more sanitized version of the crazy genius. So it's great. I mean, Russell Crowe should have got the Oscar for that, not for Gladiator, right? It was a really good depiction, but it also is, oh my God, people with schizophrenia get the Nobel Prize or they're on Telegraph Ave. Some media depictions are either people with mental illness are the most creative superheroes or you're nothing, and there's not enough depictions of sort of everyday life. I mean, Claire Danes doing a pretty good job these days, right? What do you think of Walter in Breaking Bad? Did he have antisocial personality disorder? At least he's nuanced. I think media depictions are much more realistic now, but underneath a lot of them, there's still a lot of stereotypes. Other questions about this? It's pretty provocative stuff. Let's keep going. So what can we do about stigma? What do you do about racial prejudice? What do we do about environmental change? When you're trying to make big social policy change, there's a way I tend to think about it. You have to think about your fundamental approach. Do you start at the top and go down? Do we make discrimination and stigma illegal? What did the Federal Civil Rights Act of '64 do? It made discrimination on the basis of racial characteristics illegal. Maybe that's what you have to do. So now, if you're offered health insurance in a company of more than 50 people, the company and the insurer can't discriminate and say, oh, we'll treat your lung condition but not your mental condition. So we've made it more illegal to have non-parity. The ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990, makes it illegal to receive discrimination for a physical or mental disability in the workplace or in public. Those are really important. States should change their laws to make sure that people with histories of mental disorder could vote or serve on juries or have custody of their kids. But does that change everything? No. Maybe changing the system isn't enough. So let's go down a notch. Maybe it's the media, just like this question, just like other stuff we've been talking about. If there were more accurate portrayals on the internet, on TV, in blogs, etc., mental disorder is pretty common. It's not super rare. We've talked about this with many conditions in the class. And if that were now accepted and everybody talked about it and the media depictions were less stereotypic, maybe that would eradicate stigma or at least reduce it. Or maybe it's the self-help movement. Maybe it's advocacy groups. It worked for women's rights. It worked for black power. Maybe people with mental disorders have to form groups and say, we're going to protest these ridiculous stereotyped media presentations. And we're going to demand that people learn more about mental illness. And we're going to be part of everyday life because probably in terms of the evidence, the best way to reduce prejudice and stigma is to actually have contact with people. Because then they're not in a box, they're not in a bubble. So top-down, media, group formation. What about one-on-one? Maybe you've got to go bottom-up. All the law changes in the world aren't going to replace more empathy. So how do we get more empathy? Well, education seems like a good idea, but what do we know about teaching facts about mental illness? It's helpful, and the American populace knows a lot more. So compared to the 40s and 50s, if you ask average Americans, give them a description of certain behavior, people, much more, twice as many people now can say, well, that looks like schizophrenia, or that's an eating disorder, that's alcoholism. Why? People take psychology courses in high school now. The newspapers do a better job than they used to. So knowledge is up. And what about attitudes? They've stayed almost level for the last 60 years, except that 3 times more people today than in the 50s think mental illness is linked to violence. So the stereotypes are worse. So the more we know, attitudes either stay level or get worse. Why? If you know, let's do something about it, right? Maybe knowledge alone feeds stereotypes. I was just telling somebody in office hours yesterday. Pat Corrigan, works in Chicago, professor who does a lot of stigma work, has tried 8th grade health class, mental health education. Let's teach facts about schizophrenia and depression. What do the kids do after a week or 2 of units? They learn a lot more, and they're more stigmatizing afterwards. Oh, you mean schizophrenia? Those are people who hear voices? Those people need to take medication? The facts can lead to distancing. What about teaching the facts of how many people with schizophrenia recover? Or how with treatment people with bipolar disorder can have better lives? It may not just be education about the facts, but education about people's lives. And at this individual level, if you're going to foster empathy, you've got to have contact. So the best educational programs involve people with mental illness coming in and talking to the lawyer's office or the dentist's office, or coming in talking to the middle school. Oh my God, I thought all people with mental illness were crazy, and here's a person who seems like he or she has their shit together, and it changes my stereotype. I feel empathic. So if you're going to do social change, I think you need to start with laws and policy and anti-discrimination. I think the media is important. I think groups need to align and get solidarity. And I think you need to create empathy at the individual level. And how do you do all 4 of those at once? It's expensive. It takes time. It's not going to be solved overnight. So questions about this? Stigma and overcoming it. Yeah, I mean, humanization goes for the education of medical and mental health professionals too. Because what do medical schools still teach a lot? Us, the healthy, versus them, the sick. Powerful versus not powerful. So I hope we provoked some thought about stigma, and we'll see you next Monday for a much more personal talk about families and mental illness. See you then.